It's actually pretty easy to create some surprising, more interesting short chord progressions that still have sort of a natural flow to them. So there really is no reason why most pop music is just recycling the same chord progressions all the time. Instead of taking a pop song and then trying to make it better by turning all the chords into 7 sus 4 and major 7, because I don't think that really works very often, then I thought it would be much more interesting to take some simple chords like triads and then just explore what's possible. And it's actually pretty mind-blowing and a lot of fun to mess around with. When I was starting out learning guitar, then I often found myself trying to create new music, mainly because I just got bored with just practicing my classical guitar homework. So once I learned to play some chords, I was always messing around with how to fit chords together and make my own progressions. Now, in the beginning, this was completely random and most of it sounded horrible, but learning how you have 1, 4 and 5 chords in a key and how relative minor works and sort of gives you a few more options, that made that a lot easier. But then I ended up with another problem because the chord progressions just all sounded the same. And with the random chords, it was difficult to find something, but sometimes there was something really nice and very different that really worked. I just didn't know why. In the meantime, I've learned a lot of theory, so now it's a lot easier to explain why a lot of those chord progressions work, even though it's not always the case that I know exactly why something works, and that's also not what's really important. Let's actually just start with sort of the most cliché pop progression that there is. Instead of writing a song on top of this chord progression, then you can also try and see if you can make some variations on it that are maybe a little bit more surprising. And this is really just about knowing the key better. This is in the key of C major, obviously, and you probably know the diatonic chords of C major already. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, and C major. You can probably see that I'm playing these with these spread triads, and I'm going to talk about why I'm doing that a little bit later. Now, one thing that you can do when you're in the key of C major is that you can borrow some chords from C minor, because they will often work as well. Let's just take a look at what chords we have there. So C minor, D diminished, E flat major, F minor, G minor, A flat major, B flat major, and C minor. So now we have a lot more to choose from. And if we take that first example, then we can keep the chords the same, but then just change them a bit and borrow sort of the minor version of them as well. That gives you this. And even just using G minor and F minor here really changes the sound a lot. The G minor has sort of a Coldplay sound to me, because they do that quite a lot. You probably know. Which kind of does the same thing. So you're starting with a major chord on the tonic and then moving to a minor chord on the 5th degree. Now, the way to explore this is probably just to experiment. You can get chords to work together without really thinking about any types or rules. For example, you can do something like this, where the first half is really just using chords from the major key, and then the second half is more borrowing from minor. Coming from jazz, then what I always liked about exploring these triad progressions is that you can really dig into sort of the basic strong harmony and how that flow works. And you can also create some new and more fresh sounding chord progressions by just changing a note here and there, and then you're gonna end up with some completely different chords than what we're used to and some different chord progressions. And actually, I used this quite a lot when I was writing music for especially the third, but also the second Trappen album. One thing that's going to make it a lot easier to go from chord to chord and give you a lot more options is to use inversions of the triads. So if you're not familiar with the spread triads, I'm just quickly gonna show you some inversions so that you can follow along with what I'm working with here. So for the C major triad, you have these inversions. And for A minor, you would have this. And you'll actually also see me use different fingerings for some of these chords. So I might play the C major like this, but in other places, it makes more sense to play it like this. And the same goes for the first inversion here. So I might use this one, but you'll also see me use this one. And it's really just about where I'm putting that middle note. The same thing happens with A minor, where you have this. And you've already seen me use this one as well. And this is really just about what works better when I'm moving to the next chord and what makes it easier to play. So if we use this on the chord progression that we just created, so and here is really the stepwise movement that works so well. So you have first the C major, and then it's going down to G minor with B flat in the bass, down to A minor, and then F minor with A flat in the bass. But you can also make something that moves completely differently, like this one that moves to E flat, which is of course also just a chord that we borrowed from C minor. So as you can hear, there are a lot of stuff to explore, and you can create some really beautiful progressions with this. As you can see, that I'm building all of this around these spread or open voice triads, which are really just triads where one of the notes have been moved an octave. So you can look at this and see that as coming from a C root position, from this essentially, where the second note, the E, is moved up an octave. So instead of having, I have. When you're exploring harmony like this, then I find these super useful because there are only 3 notes. I like it to not be too many notes, that makes it difficult. And also because they're opened up, then it's a little bit easier to just alter them and change a note here and there. So just to give you an example of that, if you have an A minor like this, then you can take the outer voices and move those down a half step. And you can take the middle voice and then move that up a half step. And then you have, which kind of sounds like A minor to G sharp diminished to A minor, or it's kind of like an A minor to an E7 flat 9 back to A minor. And that's just a nice way of having those voices moving. And you actually think about how they're moving and not so much about, oh, I want to play 1-5-1. Another advantage is that it's often easier to add a melody note on top of these 3-note voicings, and just to have a little bit of melodic movement on top of the chord progression really makes it sound so much better. So for instance, if I take a chord progression like this, then I can add a little bit of melody on top of it and make it a little bit more interesting and make it flow a little bit better. Let's try another chord progression, and in this one I'm being even more free with the chord choices and really just using something that I know resolves to a chord that works. This is in C major, so most of it really just makes sense as being chords in C major, these two. This one, last one, is of course borrowed from C minor, so that makes sense as well. The only one that's a little bit weird here is the D with F sharp in the bass. And I think the best way to think of that one is, you can actually explain this one from sort of a theoretical standpoint, but it's also just a suspension. It's also just a chord that moves down to this one, and because it moves in the right way, it just makes sense. You don't really have to think about what kind of chord it is for the rest. Now, if you want to add melody to this, then that's actually pretty simple. You just add some stepwise motion, keep it calm, and just try to sort of tie together the transition from chord to chord. Another way to get some more chords into the progression that really flow nicely into each other is to use dominance for some of the other chords. So we're in the key of C major today. If I want to move from C major to A minor, then I can use the dominant of A minor, which is of course E major. If I'm using that chord, then it's quite easily going to flow into the progression. It's going to be easy to get that to sound nice. If you add a few inversions, then you get something like this. So just to break this down, I'm starting with this C major, and then I'm moving to E major by moving the 2 lower voices, and I'm moving those in opposite direction. This is something that pretty much always sounds nice to do. So C down to B, and G up to G sharp, and there I have my E with B in the bass. Then I'm resolving that down to A minor, and then I'm using G minor with B flat in the bass to take me back to C major. So the dominant of C major is of course a G major chord, it's not a G minor chord, but I really like the sound of G minor as a dominant in a major key. Actually, I just really like sort of the sound of the minor dominant. Maybe something that I got from Scandinavian folk music. I don't know where Coldplay got it from. They seem to like it as well. It is definitely something that you'll find in a lot of Scandinavian folk music. Usually there it's in minor, so you'll have stuff that's like... where sort of the classical way of doing this would probably sound like this. As you can tell, then I'm not treating this as a set of rules that you have to follow. I change stuff around all the time, and I'm just experimenting, trying to find stuff that I like the sound of, and then I try to figure out what that actually is. Now, in general, it's actually really useful to understand harmony, and especially if you're trying to play jazz, you want to learn how to understand jazz harmony. And you can do that by checking out this video where I cover how I think about this, how harmony makes sense, but there are also a few tricks from Barry Harris and Pat Martino that are definitely worth checking out.